This is an essential point. I know that people don't like Donald Trump. I know they're worried about what his policies might be, although we haven't seen what those policies are yet. They didn't like J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. But the right response to that is to get together, figure out what's needed, do your own homework, and propose what Europe is prepared to do as a solution. That is the most constructive way to engage the United States administration right now. Be proactive and propose things, show what Europe is willing to do. That is something that a US administration could deal with and react to. In the absence of that, what I describe as the default setting in Europe, which is to wait, worry, and complain, that produces the worst possible response from Washington.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Kurt Volker, former US ambassador to NATO from 2008 to 2009 and a distinguished fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Kurt, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
The British Foreign Minister has said the UK wants to become a bridge between Europe and the US on issues of security. How dearly do you think Donald Trump holds the special relationship?
He always has had an affinity for the UK. That was clear from his first term. Of course, he has that golf club up in Scotland, which he has great affection for as well. So there's a good relationship there. In his second term, he has demonstrated a very assertive foreign policy, and that is putting us into conflict with a lot of our allies, including Canada, for example. And of course, as a politician, he's coming at it more from the conservative populist side, so is much closer, for example, to Tories or even perhaps to Reform than he has been to Labour. So there's different dynamics there, but I think if anyone can be a bridge between the US and Europe, it is probably the UK.
And British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has said the UK is ready to send troops to Ukraine. At Munich, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defence, of course, for the US, had said that any European nations won't necessarily have Article 5 support in Ukraine. Is that realistic? And is that's something of a shift for the alliance in NATO, certainly to announce it like that?
No, it's not. That's not a shift. If you think about it, we've had deployments either as individual countries or even as NATO-led operations in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, NATO training mission in Iraq. And then individually, of course, we've had Vietnam and Algeria and things like that, ISIS. And Article 5 has not applied to any of those operations. Those are expeditionary operations outside NATO territory. Article 5 applies to an attack on NATO territory, according to the treaty. And so this is really no change. It's interesting that both Hegseth, by making this comment, and also the media in pouncing on this comment, are treating it somehow as though it is something new.
And so there shouldn't be any concern from European nations that if they did end up putting troops into Ukraine, and as a response there was some sort of threat to NATO territory or those nations' territories themselves, they shouldn't be worried about Article 5 being in question there.
Exactly. Yeah, they're two different things. Article 5 is about protection of NATO countries, and a deterrence mission in Ukraine would be an expeditionary operation.
And, Pete Hegseth has softened slightly on some of his comments made at Munich, but Keir Starmer is now calling for a US security backstop for any peacekeeping force. What do you think that could look like? And is that a realistic ask of the US at this point?
Yeah, that's a different question than Article 5. I think it's very realistic, and I would hope that a Trump administration would take that seriously if indeed European NATO allies were taking the lead on the ground in an operation in Ukraine. So what would that look like? First thing is to define the mission. What is it that forces in Ukraine would be doing? I've heard some people refer to this as peacekeeping. I don't agree with that term because we're not a neutral interpositionary force between two warring parties. This is about preventing future Russian attacks on Ukraine. So it's a deterrence force. I've also heard the word tripwire force, which has two implications. One, it means you're sitting there on the front line waiting for someone to trip the wire. The other is that it automatically brings in a forceful response should someone trip that wire. And I don't think that quite captures the concept of what the mission should be. I would define the mission as a deterrence mission, which means it would follow a ceasefire. So you have in practice a de facto ceasefire, and then you put a sufficient capability in Ukraine to make clear to Putin that if he were to attack again, there is a capacity to respond, and he shouldn't do that. I think that means you'd have to have a willingness to respond. If indeed Russia attacked again after a ceasefire, you'd have to be willing to fire back. But the purpose of that would be to ratchet it back down to zero, to make sure there is no fighting going on, not to try to defeat the Russian forces. And in terms of what they would do as a mission, I would view this more as a train and equip and assist the Ukrainian forces. So trainers, helping them get and appropriately integrate and use the Western kit that they're going to be getting, and also provide assistance, particularly with air defense. I think that NATO countries could have extended air defense from Poland and Romania, and possibly even deploy some mobile air defense units in Ukraine, so that if Russia were to violate the ceasefire, that there would be additional protection for Ukrainian cities and civilians beyond what already exists. I think that sort of mission would make sense. I think it would be scalable, therefore, in a way that European nations could actually do it. And I think it could contribute to a deterrence. And what would the U.S. role in that be? I think ISR, as we say, the intelligence, satellite reconnaissance. I think potentially long-range equipment over the horizon, air power, for example, over the horizon, logistical and enabling support to facilitate the supply and the sustainment of those European forces in theater. Those would be the sorts of things that I think would make sense. Now, this has not been fleshed out. It's my talking, not NATO, not US, and even from this meeting in Paris that took place yesterday, they did not advance this concept at all. But if I were to suggest or predict where this goes, I think that's the sort of thing we're talking about.
So, in your mind, at least, there is a realistic prospect that Europe can provide this sort of security guarantee and, as you say, deterrence force.
Yeah, I think they have the means to do that. Yes, and with U.S. backup, the way to think of this is that NATO Article 5 defense commitment on a scale of 1 to 10 is 10. That it's obvious there's a response, and anyone wouldn't dare attack NATO knowing that. Budapest Memorandum, piece of paper says we'll protect your borders, and then it's violated, nobody does anything. That's a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10. What we need is something that's like a 7 or an 8 or a 9. It's not NATO, but it is getting close to that and has the effect of convincing Vladimir Putin, testing it's not worth it.
And Hegseth did also note, of course, though, that the US faces what he calls stark strategic realities that mean Europe can't be as much of a priority for US defense right now. I mean, that's not an unfair statement to make, is it, given what's going on in the Pacific and the Middle East?
Definitely. No, it's not. And in fact, it's so funny how much of what the media reports is shocking when it's not new. That this is true, back to the Obama administration. President Obama was talking about this. True in Trump's first term and even true under Biden. Europe is important, but we have serious challenges in Asia. We have the risk of war there. We have an active war in the Middle East, and one that could get far worse and far bigger, particularly with Iran seeking to develop nuclear weapons. So there are real issues out there. And I was reading something that someone commented on the other day. If you start comparing the population of Europe and the population of the United States, it's 500 million to 300 and some million. And yet the US is spending more on defense for the world, and Europe is spending less on defense for Europe. It is out of balance. And that's what American leaders have been talking about for a generation. And I think it's fair to say that we need to see Europe do more, and the US is going to have to focus on some things elsewhere.
And European leaders have met to discuss Ukraine and European security in Paris just yesterday. Is there anything that they can do immediately that would demonstrate this renewed dedication to NATO and European defense that the Americans have called for?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an essential point. I know that people don't like Donald Trump. I know they're worried about what his policies might be, although we haven't seen what those policies are yet. They didn't like J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. But the right response to that is to get together, figure out what's needed, do your own homework, and propose what Europe is prepared to do as a solution. That is the most constructive way to engage the United States administration right now. Be proactive and propose things, show what Europe is willing to do. That is something that a U.S. administration could deal with and react to. In the absence of that, what I describe as the default setting in Europe, which is to wait, worry, and complain, that produces the worst possible response from Washington.
Where are these key areas that the Europeans worry about in terms of being able to form an effective defense against Russia? I mean, Russia does now have this significant military and a wartime economy. Should that not be a worry for the Europeans that they are that far behind being able to match what the Russian capabilities are?
Yeah, it should be a worry because, again, if you're talking about Russia with a population of just north of 100 million, and Europe with 500 million, and a European GDP that is at, 7 times that of Russia? How is it that Russia is able to mount such a military force and threat that Europe can't deal with it? That's what Europe ought to be asking itself.
And partners like Poland and the Baltic states, they've shown a hesitancy over the idea of a European security force as a guarantee for Ukraine. Is there anything you actually think that the Trump administration could do to provide European partners with technology, arms deals that might tip them a bit more in favor of this idea?
Well, Poland, of course, is a neighboring country, and some of Ukrainian territory at one time was part of Poland. So they're very sensitive about talking about Polish forces in Ukraine. That does have a neighborly political sensitivity. And of course, Poland has a presidential election coming up, and this is not a topic they really want to be throwing around in a presidential election. Baltic states, they're very small. Their contributions would potentially be very small. But I think Lithuania, for example, probably would want to contribute to a mission in Ukraine. They do worry, however, that a mission in Ukraine should not take forces away from a deterrence posture in the Baltic states themselves, because they have that border with Russia as well. As far as what the U.S. could do, I think it's, again, flipping it around. It's what Europe can do. I think Europe can and should seize the frozen Russian assets. There's about $300 billion worth of assets in Europe that are frozen. Seize those assets and take some of that money and buy weapons from the United States. They would be immediately available. The defense production can be there, and they could be used to strengthen European security, and they could also be used to support Ukraine. And that would be a way of connecting the U.S. and Europe and Ukraine, and it would be providing some immediate capability. Another thing that they could do is, as we just discussed, come up with the concept, work with the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the DSACEUR, who's European, to put together a concept for a deterrence force. and then figure out what it takes to staff it out and to equip it and to sustain it logistically, put that all together and come to the US with a plan. That would be a constructive step.
Is there not a worry though that seizing those frozen Russian assets and sending them to Ukraine at this point could jeopardize the talks that are going on at the moment?
The worry ought to be that failure to seize them and use them gives Russia an advantage financially, militarily, and on the battlefield. And we see that. Moreover, if you saw the statements by the so-called foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, absolutely uncompromising, ridiculous demands coming from Russia. The Ukraine ceding territory that Russia hasn't even been able to take militarily, the territory of these 4 provinces that Russia claims to have annexed. No military force, so a demilitarized Ukraine, a neutral Ukraine that is kept away from the rest of Europe. This is a outrageous set of demands. It basically subjects Ukraine, subordinates Ukraine to the Russian Empire. Clearly unacceptable. So if that's where Russia is coming from, and this is just yesterday in the commentary from Lavrov, I don't understand what Europe could possibly be worried about in seizing these assets and disrupting negotiations.
And we mentioned before, Poland has an election coming up. Germany as well, of course, imminently has this election coming up. They're perhaps a linchpin in Europe's security, and especially their backing for Ukraine. How could a seeming change in leadership in Germany change support for Ukraine and also the way that Europe interacts with the US?
Yeah. For the past several years, we had Chancellor Scholz in Germany and President Biden in the United States. And you had most of the allies, leaving aside Hungary and recently Slovakia, you had most of the allies arguing for more, better, faster support for Ukraine, and even a pathway for Ukraine to get into NATO quickly. And it was the US and Germany that were resisting that. We now have a complete wild card in the US with President Trump. He's trying to stop the war by engaging Putin. If Putin backs up Lavrov's comments, it could go exactly the opposite direction, with the US ramping up pressure on Russia. And the question is, where will Germany be? And where Germany will be is Scholz will be out. So the kind of go slow, be cautious approach we've seen from Germany for the past many years will be gone. Who forms the next government depends not only on Friedrich Merz leading the CDU and being able to form that government, but how do the smaller parties do? And what is the math that allows him to form a coalition government? It seems likely that that would be a coalition that he would lead, but would have the Social Democrats in it still in a grand coalition, and possibly another party or two. Now, that being the case, the CDU has been more robust in calling for support for Ukraine and calling for Germany to step up its defense spending, correcting the years of inaction, and building a capability so that they can do more for European defense and for projecting that for security in Ukraine. So that's where Merz is coming from generally. That bodes well for Ukraine if that's the case. But of course, what we don't know is the composition of the coalition, and therefore what Merz will be able to get through in a coalition agreement.
And as we're speaking, as you've noted, those talks are getting underway between the US and Russia in Riyadh. There's been a lot of concern that Ukraine is being left out of negotiations. Is that the case, or are these more preliminary talks that could look to a wider negotiation?
Very much the latter. It's preliminary talks, and the concerns expressed are vastly overblown. We've had multiple consultations. President Trump has spoken with President Zelensky I think 4 times throughout September, October. He met with him in New York. He met with him in Paris at the Notre Dame opening. He's talked to him on the phone. The vice president met with Zelensky in Munich. The Secretary of Treasury was in Kyiv and met with him. We've had lots and lots of consultations. There's no mystery about Ukraine's position, and that's understood by the United States. We've also had the defense secretary meeting with NATO defense ministers. We had a huge delegation in Munich meeting with European leaders. There's a lot of consultation, and there is no table. So people are saying they don't have a seat at the table because there is no table. This is President Trump calling Putin, President Trump calling Zelensky, people meeting and talking with each other all over the place. And here is a bilateral discussion between the US and Russia, as you said, as a preliminary step to see whether there can be any negotiation. Where is Russia coming from? And it is very similar to what was done in the past. When the Obama administration first had a special representative for Ukraine, she would meet with the Russians separately, meet with Ukrainians separately, meet with Europeans separately. We were not part of the Minsk process. I did the same thing when I was in that capacity. This is not new. So I think all the reactions here are reflecting anxieties that people have about the content because they don't know where it's going, but complaining about this as a process, it's normal.
And Keith Kellogg has stayed in Europe meanwhile. You're someone who will, of course, have a lot of experience in dealing with America's European partners. How much of a task will he face to sort of calm heads in the EU and make sense of what security guarantees they're ready to provide?
Yeah, well, it's not his task to do that yet. What's happened here is he is the special representative for Ukraine and Russia and special assistant to the president. And the president has asked him to go to Ukraine to meet at NATO, meet with our European allies. And there's a separate track of talking with the Russians, which Secretary Rubio, Mike Waltz, and Steve Witkoff are doing in Saudi Arabia. They're all gathering information, gathering perspectives, listening to people, and then they'll all be coming back to Washington and meeting with President Trump. And President Trump will take measure of where things are and decide what he wants to do next. So I don't think that Kellogg is in the position right now of calming and reassuring. He's in a position of establishing contacts, listening to what people's concerns are, trying to identify what is possible, what Europeans think is possible, and then reporting back.
Kurt Volker, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.